John came to the mountains to outrun memories that had the persistence of wolves. They were patient, they knew his scent, and they were always just beyond the tree line of his thoughts, waiting for the fire to burn low. He had chosen this specific fold in the Washington Cascades for its silence, a deep, resonant quiet that was more than an absence of noise. It was a presence, a weight of granite and ancient cedar that he hoped could press the ghosts flat, make them two-dimensional and powerless. He moved through this world with the economy of a man who had spent years learning that wasted motion was a prelude to disaster. At 42, he was carved from the same hard material as the landscape he now inhabited, lean and functional, the softness of youth long since stripped away by harsh suns and colder decisions. His uniform was constant, a second skin. A faded olive M65 field jacket, a plaid flannel shirt that had seen 1,000 washings, cargo pants, and a pair of leather boots so worn they looked like a topographical map of every mile he had ever walked away from his life. At his side, moving with a fluid grace that belied his age, was Ghost. The German Shepherd was a veteran of a different kind of war, but a veteran nonetheless. The fur around his muzzle was a distinguished silver gray, and his eyes, dark and intelligent, held a deep, knowing calm. He was not a pet. He was a partner, the last living remnant of a life defined by professional certainties. They had served together, breathed the same dust in places John no longer allowed his mind to visit, and their communication had evolved beyond words into a complex language of shared glances, subtle shifts in weight, and the rhythm of their breathing. Ghost was a living anchor to the discipline John clung to, a reminder that duty, in some form, still existed. He carried his own gear, a specialized harness with pouches, and he never strayed far, his presence a silent, steady declaration that they were a unit of two. They made camp by a lake whose surface was the color of polished steel under the bruised purple of the evening sky. The process was a ritual, a silent meditation of precise, practiced movements. John unslung his Eberly stock half-track pack, its familiar weight a comfort. He didn't pitch a tent, preferring the open air and the discipline of a simple bivy sack. He laid out his sleeping bag, arranged his small stove, and filtered water from the glacial melt that fed the lake. Every action was deliberate, a bulwark against the chaos that threatened to rise from within. He checked the battered face of his military-issue watch, a habit ingrained so deeply it felt like a part of his own pulse. Time was a thing to be measured, controlled, endured. It was then that he noticed the change in Ghost. The dog had been sitting, observing the perimeter with the placid focus of a seasoned sentry. Now, he was rigid. Not the sharp, forward-leaning posture of a predator sighted, but a deep, unnerving stillness. His head was cocked, his ears swiveling like sensitive antennae, tuning into a frequency far beyond John's perception. A low whine, barely a vibration, emanated from his chest. His gaze was fixed, not on the dense forest or the opposite shore, but on a nondescript patch of ground 50 yards away, where a stand of hemlock gave way to a jumble of moss-covered boulders. John stopped what he was doing. He trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. His senses, though honed by years of training, were fallible, clouded by memory and fatigue. Ghosts were pure. The dog knew the language of the wild, the subtle grammar of a snapped twig, a displaced stone, the scent of something that was simply wrong. John scanned the area the dog was focused on, his eyes tracing the patterns of light and shadow. He saw nothing. The wind sighed through the pines, the lake lapped quietly at the shore. Everything was as it should be. But Ghost did not relax. He rose, stretched his neck, and sniffed the air again, a deep, analytical inhalation. He took a few stiff steps in the direction of the rocks, then stopped and looked back at John, his expression a clear and urgent question. There was no fear in it, only a profound sense of incorrectness, as if he had detected a single discordant note in the grand symphony of the wilderness. "What is it, boy?" John murmured, his voice a low rasp, unused for most of the day. The dog whined again, a soft, insistent sound. He was telling John that the silence they had sought was a deception. There was something buried in it, something that didn't belong. John set down the water filter, his movements still calm, but now infused with a new layer of vigilance. The quiet of the mountains no longer felt like a comfort. It felt like a held breath. The memories he had come here to escape felt distant for the first time in a long time, replaced by a more immediate and tangible unease. He slung his pack back on, its weight a familiar burden. Whatever Ghost had found, they would face it together. The old training, the instinct to investigate the anomaly, was rising through him like groundwater. He was no longer a man in hiding. He was an operator again, and his partner had just given him a signal. The next morning broke cold and clear, the air so clean it felt sharp in the lungs. The sun cast long, probing fingers of light through the canopy, illuminating motes of dust and pollen dancing in the still air. John had slept little, the dog's unease having seeped into his own bones. He had lain awake, listening to the night, cataloging its sounds, his senses on high alert. Ghost had remained watchful, a dark, silent shape at the edge of his camp, a guardian against a threat that remained unseen and undefined. They ate a breakfast of cold rations, a shared routine that needed no words. John packed his meager camp with swift efficiency, erasing any sign of his presence. He was a ghost in this landscape, or so he had tried to be. Ghost did not wait for a command. As John secured the last buckle on his pack, the dog turned and began moving with quiet purpose. He didn't take the faint game trail they had followed yesterday. Instead, he forged a new path, heading directly for the stand of hemlock and the jumble of boulders that had captured his attention the evening before. John followed without question. The dog's gait was not the relaxed trot of a walk, but the focused, deliberate pace of an animal on a mission. He navigated the undergrowth with an intelligence that was more than instinct, as if following a scent or a sound that was imperceptible to John. They pushed through a thicket of salmonberry bushes, the branches scratching at John's jacket. The ground grew softer underfoot, a deep carpet of pine needles and damp earth. They came to the spot. It was dominated by the immense, moss-shrouded trunk of a fallen Douglas fir, a giant that must have come down decades ago. Its root ball, ripped from the earth, stood like a gnarled earthen wall 10 feet high. To the casual observer, it was just another feature of the forest's slow, chaotic cycle of decay and rebirth. But Ghost saw something else. He went straight to the base of the root ball, where the earth was a churned-up mix of soil, rock, and splintered wood. He sniffed intently at one spot, his tail held low and stiff. Then, he began to dig. His paws moved with a frantic, controlled energy, flinging soil and debris behind him. This was not the playful digging of a pet. This was work. It was the same focused intensity he had once used to locate buried explosives in a sun-baked desert half a world away. John watched, his sense of unease solidifying into sharp-edged certainty. He knelt beside the dog, running a hand over the damp earth. The ground here felt different, firmer. He pushed his fingers into the soil where Ghost was digging and hit something hard and flat just a few inches down. It wasn't rock. Rock was uneven, textured. This was smooth, unyielding, and wrong. "Easy, boy," John said, placing a calming hand on Ghost's neck. The dog stopped digging but remained focused on the spot, panting lightly, his eyes fixed on the disturbed earth. John pulled his folding knife from his pocket, the click of the blade locking into place unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. He used the tip to carefully scrape away the soil. He uncovered a flat, metallic surface, dark with rust but unmistakably man-made. He worked methodically, clearing a larger area. He exposed a corner, a right angle of thick steel, and along its edge, a series of heavy-duty rivets. Then he saw it. A small rectangular plate welded to the surface, and on it, faded but still legible, were stenciled letters and numbers. It was a corner fitting, an ISO standard plate from a shipping container. A cold wave washed over him. A shipping container. Here, miles from any road, buried at the base of a fallen giant. It was impossible. He stood up and took a step back, his training kicking in, forcing him to see the whole picture. He looked at the fallen fir again. The angle was too perfect. The massive trunk lay directly over the area, concealing it. The root ball formed a natural wall. It wasn't an accident. The tree had been felled deliberately, a piece of natural camouflage to hide whatever this was. He began to walk the perimeter, his eyes scanning the ground. He found what he was looking for. A subtle, almost imperceptible depression in the forest floor. A long, straight line nearly 40 feet long, disguised by decades of accumulated leaf litter and new growth. It was the footprint of the container. He followed it, his boots sinking slightly deeper than the surrounding ground. At the far end, he found another sign. A cluster of young alder trees growing in an unnaturally straight line, their roots unable to penetrate whatever lay beneath. This was a deliberate act of concealment, executed with patience and skill. Whoever had put this here had wanted it to disappear forever. The question was why? His mind, trained to analyze threats and uncover hidden objectives, began to churn. This wasn't cargo that had fallen off a truck. This was something else entirely. This was a secret, buried in the heart of the wilderness. He returned to the exposed corner. He needed to get inside. He circled the area, looking for the doors. But they were at the other end, likely buried under tons of earth and the main weight of the tree trunk. He came back to the corner Ghost had found. Above it, higher up on the visible side of the container, he saw what he was looking for. A small, square ventilation hatch, rusted but intact. It was his only way in. He used the blade of his knife, then a small pry bar from his pack to work at the edges of the hatch. The metal groaned in protest. Rust flaked away, showering his hands with red dust. For 10 minutes he worked, the rhythmic scrape and grunt of his effort the only sounds. Finally, with a shriek of tortured metal, the hatch gave way. It swung open on a single groaning hinge. A wave of stale, cold air washed over his face. It smelled of dust, of old paper, of confinement. It was not the smell of death or decay, but the scent of a place that had been sealed away from time itself. He pulled a small, powerful flashlight from a pouch on his belt. Taking a deep breath, he aimed the beam into the darkness. The light cut through the gloom, revealing an interior that made the hair on his arm stand up. It was not filled with crates or pallets. Bolted to the floor was a simple metal desk and a swivel chair. Along one wall, metal shelves were lined with thick 3-ring binders. A tangle of wires ran from a piece of defunct electronic equipment on the desk to a panel on the wall. This was not a shipping container. It had been a field office, a listening post, a hidden laboratory. It was a place where someone had worked, a place someone had inhabited before it was buried and forgotten by the world. And as his light played across the silent, dusty scene, he understood that Ghost hadn't just found something that was out of place. He had unearthed a story that had been deliberately silenced. The weight of that silence now rested squarely on his shoulders. The journey to Oakhaven was a reluctant descent from the austere purity of the high country into the cluttered reality of civilization. The small town was nestled in a valley, a collection of clapboard buildings and orderly streets that felt jarringly artificial to John after weeks in the wilderness. The air, thick with the smell of vehicle exhaust and fryer oil from the local diner, felt heavy and used. People bustled along the sidewalks, their faces open and unconcerned, their lives governed by schedules and errands that seemed trivial and impossibly distant from the cold, metal secret buried in the woods. John felt like a foreigner here, his quiet intensity and the worn, functional nature of his gear marking him as an outsider. He left Ghost secured in a shady, secluded spot at the edge of town, where he could watch the truck, giving the dog a quiet command to stay that was as binding as any leash. He walked with his head down, his gaze fixed on the cracked pavement, avoiding eye contact. The noise of it all, the chatter of voices, the rumble of a logging truck, the tinny music leaking from a storefront, was a physical assault. It was a language he no longer wished to speak. His objective was the county courthouse, a stolid brick building with a flagpole out front, the flag hanging limp in the still air. He felt the familiar constriction in his chest, the feeling of being exposed, evaluated. In the mountains, he was judged only by the weather and the terrain. Here, every glance felt like a question. Inside, the building smelled of floor wax and old paper. He found the county clerk's office, a brightly lit room filled with the hum of computers and the rhythmic chunk of a date stamp. Behind a long wooden counter sat a woman who seemed as rooted to the place as the building itself. She was in her late 50s, tall and spare, with intelligent eyes behind a pair of reading glasses. A nameplate on the counter read, Martha Riley, County Clerk. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral but appraising. She took in his field jacket, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way he held himself with a stillness that was not entirely calm. "Can I help you?" Her voice was crisp, businesslike. "I need to see some old land survey maps," John said, his own voice sounding rusty to his ears. "And property deeds, from the 1970s. Martha Riley's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. It was not a typical request. "What area specifically?" John unfolded a topographical map from his pocket and spread it on the counter. He pointed to the remote section of National Forest where he had found the container. "This quadrant here, around the basin of Lake Alcott." She studied the map, then him. Her gaze was sharp, missing nothing. "That's all federal land. Has been since the park was established." "There are no private deeds." "I'm looking for government projects," John clarified. "Leases, easements, temporary use permits. Anything from, say, 1975 to 1979. She was silent for a long moment, her fingers drumming a soft, thoughtful rhythm on the polished wood. She was a gatekeeper, and he knew she was deciding whether he was a threat, a nuisance, or someone worth helping. "That's a lot of archive to go through for a maybe. What's this regarding?" John held her gaze. He had learned long ago that evasion with people like this was a mistake. They valued directness. "I found something up there that shouldn't be there. I'm trying to figure out how it got there." His simple, unadorned honesty seemed to land. She gave a slight nod, a concession. "All right, let's see what we have." She led him to a back room, a library of dust and time, filled with oversized, leather-bound plat books and cabinets of microfiche. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and binding glue. For the next hour, they worked in a companionable silence, Martha's initial caution replaced by a grudging professional respect. She was competent, navigating the arcane filing system with an ease born of long practice. Finally, she pulled a large, rolled-up map from a dusty cardboard tube. It was a Forest Service survey map from 1977. She spread it out on a large table, weighing down the corners. "Here we are," she said, her finger tracing a line. "Most of this is standard, but look here." She pointed to a small rectangular area within the quadrant John had indicated. It was outlined in red ink, and across it, a single word was stamped: redacted. In the margin, a faint pencil notation read, USGS Project 77B, Seismic Survey, Term 1978. "Terminated," Martha murmured, more to herself than to him. "That's odd. These projects usually run for years."
And I've never seen a federal survey parcel redacted on a public access map.
She looked at John. "This is what you're looking for, isn't it?" "I think so," he said. "Do you know anyone who worked for the Forest Service back then? Someone who might remember this?" Martha thought for a moment. "Most of them are gone or moved away. But there's Elias Vance. He was the lead cartographer for this whole district for 30 years. Retired now. Lives out on the River Road. If anyone knows what this was, it's him. He has a memory like a steel trap." She wrote down an address on a slip of paper and handed it to him. "Be warned. He can be a bit of a crank. Hates being bothered. But if you tell him Martha Riley sent you, he might talk to you." John found Elias Vance's home an hour later, a small, meticulously kept cabin overlooking a fast-moving river. The man himself was as weathered as the landscape, with a shock of white hair and hands gnarled by arthritis, but still capable.
He was sitting on his porch, sharpening the blade of an old crosscut saw, and he watched John's approach with undisguised suspicion.
"Martha Riley sent me," John said, stopping at the foot of the porch steps, giving the man his space. "I'm looking for information about a survey project from 1977. Elias set down his file. "Project 77B. It wasn't a question. John nodded, surprised. "You remember it?" "I remember everything that was ever put on a map in this county," Elias said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "That one was strange from the start. Came down from on high. We were told to map the boundaries for a contractor doing seismic monitoring for the USGS. They brought in their own gear, their own crew. Very secretive. We were told to stay clear." "What happened to it?" John asked. "It just stopped," Elias said, squinting at the memory. "They were there for maybe 18 months. Then one day, they were gone. The official story was budget cuts, a project reevaluation.
But the crew, they were locals mostly. They were paid a hefty severance and signed non-disclosure agreements that scared them silent. The whole thing was buried, literally and figuratively. The access road was decommissioned, and the Forest Service was instructed to let it return to nature. We were told to strike the parcel from future maps." He picked up his file again, then paused. "The contractor. It wasn't a regular engineering firm. It was a shell company, a subsidiary of a big corporation. Ethelred Industries." The name landed in the quiet air like a stone. Ethelred Industries. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in John's gut. He had heard that name before, in a dusty village in a far-off country, whispered by a man whose life he had failed to protect. He thanked Elias and left, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening finality. He drove back to the edge of town, his mind racing. The seismic survey was a lie, a cover story. Ethelred Industries. The secrecy. The non-disclosure agreements. It all pointed to something illicit, something that had to be hidden at all costs. Back in the deep woods, with Ghost standing silent watch, John returned to the container. The sun was beginning to set, casting the forest in long, deep shadows. He worked the main doors with the pry bar and a small hand winch from his pack. It was grueling work. The doors were sealed with rust and time. But finally, with a deafening screech of metal, one door broke free, swinging inward into the darkness. The interior was as he'd seen through the hatch, but now he could enter. He stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He went straight to the shelves. The binders were filled with geological charts and logs of seismic readings. But in the margins of the logbooks, he found what he was looking for: handwritten notes. The official entries were dry, technical. The notes were something else entirely. Reading at 300 meters doesn't match strata. Void? Man-made? Another entry, weeks later. Pressure fluctuations inconsistent with natural geology. It's a leak. The final entries were scribbled, the handwriting frantic. They know I know. They're not monitoring earthquakes. They're monitoring their own poison. God help us. His light fell on a heavy-duty steel footlocker tucked under the desk. It was locked. He broke the padlock with the pry bar. Inside, beneath a few personal items, a worn copy of a book, a photograph of a smiling woman, was a small portable cassette recorder and a neat stack of audio tapes, each labeled with a date. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had a similar device in his own pack, a relic he kept for nostalgia. He took one of the tapes, labeled with the latest date, and slid it into his player. He pressed play. A man's voice filled the silent container, distorted by the small speaker but clear and steady. It was a voice filled with a terrible, resigned calm. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne. I am, or was, a geologist contracted for USGS Project 77B. This is a lie. The project is a front for Ethelred Industries. For 18 months, I have been monitoring what I was told were deep earth tremors. I have discovered the truth. They are not tremors. They are pressure shifts from a deep injection well, an illegal disposal site for thousands of barrels of highly toxic chemical byproducts from Ethelred's manufacturing processes. The containment is failing. The material is leaking toward the aquifer that feeds this entire valley. The voice cracked for a moment. I have confronted them with my data. They are coming for me. I will not be silenced. I have sent copies of my core data to a trusted colleague. This container, these tapes, are the rest of it. My proof. My testimony. There was a pause, the sound of a deep, shuddering breath. If you are hearing this, it is because they have succeeded. Please get this to the authorities. Don't let them bury this. Don't let them poison this valley for the sake of their profits. He paused again. And if it's not too much to ask, tell my brother. Tell him I'm sorry I'll miss his return. He's with the teams. Tell him I was proud of him. John's blood ran cold. He sank down onto the edge of the desk, the tape player slipping from his numb fingers. Thorne. The name echoed across the years, from a rooftop in Kandahar. The asset. The local guide who had trusted him, whose family he had promised to protect. The man whose brother was a geologist who had gone missing stateside years ago. A promise he had broken in a moment of tactical choice, choosing the mission over the man. He had run from that memory, from that failure, for 5 years. And now, in a cold, dark metal box in the middle of the American wilderness, it had found him. The ghost he had been fleeing wasn't in his past. It had been waiting for him here, all along. The silence that followed the end of the tape was absolute. A vacuum that pulled all the air from the steel box. John sat motionless in the dark,
the flashlight beam a solitary, trembling pillar in the gloom. The voice of Aris Thorn echoed not in the container, but inside his own skull, a ghost resurrected by magnetic tape and a shared name. The past was no longer a pursuing wolf. It was here, in the room with him, its teeth in his heart. He had come to these mountains seeking an absence, a place where the bill for his failures could not be delivered. Instead, he had stumbled into the one place on earth where the debt was due. He didn't know how long he sat there. Time had become fluid, meaningless. The disciplined operator had dissolved, leaving only the man, crushed under the immense, specific weight of his history. The failure in Afghanistan had been a complex calculus of risk and reward, a split-second decision in a maelstrom of dust and gunfire. He had chosen to secure a high-value target, sacrificing the exfiltration of his local asset, Thorn's brother. He had told himself it was the correct tactical choice. He had repeated that justification in debriefings, in reports, and in the dark of 1,000 sleepless nights. But the truth, the one that haunted him, was that it had been a failure of loyalty, a betrayal of a simple human promise. And now, fate, with its cruel and impeccable sense of irony, had delivered him the chance to fail Aris Thorn's brother all over again. A sound from outside broke the spell. A low growl from Ghost, not the warning rumble of a threat, but a deep, resonant query. The dog was checking on him, sensing the shift in his state. John pushed himself to his feet, his body stiff. He had to move. He had to think. He rewound the tape, his hands clumsy. He placed it carefully back in the footlocker with the others. This was no longer just about a corporate cover-up. It was personal. It was a penance. As he stepped out of the container into the deepening twilight, he saw the headlights. Two sharp white beams cutting through the trees, coming up the old, overgrown service road he hadn't thought a vehicle could navigate. A late-model luxury SUV, its paint job gleaming and absurdly out of place, rolled to a quiet stop 20 yards away. The engine purred, a sound of expensive, effortless power. Ghost moved to John's side, his body rigid, a low growl vibrating in his chest. The driver's side door opened. A man emerged, moving with a placid confidence that set every one of John's nerves on edge. He was in his late 40s, dressed in expensive, brand-new outdoor apparel that looked like it had been purchased for this specific occasion. He was handsome, well-groomed, his smile easy and disarming. He held his hands up in a gesture of peace, as if approaching a skittish animal.
"Evening," the man said, his voice as smooth and polished as the finish on his car. "Didn't expect to find anyone up here. Hope we're not trespassing on your campsite." John said nothing. He stood his ground in front of the open container door, a silent obstacle. Ghost remained at his heel, the growl a constant, menacing thrum. The man's smile didn't falter. He took a few steps closer, his expensive boots sinking into the soft earth. "My name is Corbin. I'm with the Ethelred Group. We're here to begin a site reclamation project. This old piece of equipment has been on our books for years, finally getting around to cleaning it up." He gestured vaguely at the container, as if it were nothing more than an old filing cabinet left behind by careless movers. His tone was breezy, dismissive, designed to make the entire situation seem mundane, a matter of simple corporate housekeeping. John's silence was a wall. He had faced men like Corbin before, men who used language as a weapon, who wielded politeness like a concealed blade. They built realities out of well-chosen words, burying truth under layers of plausible deniability. Corbin's eyes flicked from John's impassive face to the open door of the container, then back. The easy smile tightened just a fraction at the corners. "Look, I can see you've found our property, and I appreciate your curiosity, but this is a private matter. We'd be grateful if you'd allow my team to get to work. Of course, he added, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. We'd be happy to compensate you for your time and for any trouble we've caused. The offer hung in the air, greasy and insulting. It was the moment the negotiation began, the attempt to quantify his silence, to put a price on the memory of Eris Thorne. John finally spoke, his voice low and devoid of emotion.
It was a simple statement of fact, but it landed with the force of an accusation. I found Dr. Thorne's records. The mask did not slip. Corbin was a professional. But something in his eyes shifted. A light went out. The manufactured warmth was replaced by a flat, cold appraisal. He had been dealing with a curious hiker. Now he was dealing with an informed opponent. Dr. Thorne was a contract geologist who worked on a short-term project here many years ago, Corbin said smoothly, his voice a carefully modulated flow of bureaucratic anesthetic. The materials you may have found are historical documents, proprietary data that would be easily misinterpreted out of context. They are the property of our corporation. He said you were poisoning the valley, John stated, his voice still flat, holding the simple, terrible truth up like a shield. Corbin gave a small, condescending sigh. The sigh of a patient man dealing with a difficult child. With all due respect, you are not a geologist. You are not a hydrologist. You are a man with a backpack who has stumbled upon a complex industrial legacy issue. These things are best left to the experts. I listened to his last words, John said. He knew you were coming for him. This finally caused a visible crack in Corbin's composure. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. He was losing control of the narrative. He dropped the pretense of negotiation and moved to the veiled threat. You are trespassing on private property which is under a reclamation order. Your presence here is complicating a delicate legal and environmental process. I am advising you, formally, to vacate the area. If you do not, I will have to report this to the authorities, and I assure you, the legal ramifications for interfering with this operation will be significant. It was in that moment that Ghost made his judgment. The dog had been a coiled spring of potential energy at John's side. Now he took one deliberate step forward. The low growl in his chest deepened, escalating into a sound of pure, controlled menace that seemed to come from the very earth. He did not bark. He did not lunge. He simply lifted his lip on one side, revealing a long, white canine tooth. It was a minimalist gesture, a piece of silent, deadly punctuation. It was a clear, unequivocal statement that the conversation was over. It was a promise of violence, delivered with the chilling professionalism of a creature that understood its purpose perfectly. Corbin took an involuntary step back. For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear showed in his eyes. He was not afraid of John, the quiet, stubborn man. He was afraid of the dog, the animal that operated on a plane of instinct and consequence he could not negotiate with. He regained his composure quickly, smoothing his expensive jacket. He gave John a final, hard look. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice clipped. He turned, walked back to his SUV, and got in. The vehicle turned around with a quiet crunch of leaves and drove away, its red taillights disappearing into the oppressive dark of the forest. John stood for a long time, the cold night air doing little to cool the heat in his chest. He placed a hand on Ghost's head, the thick fur a comfort. The dog relaxed, the growl subsiding, and leaned his weight against John's leg. The polite threat was gone, but the real one was just beginning. Corbin would be back, and he would not come back alone. The mountain's silence was shattered for good, and a storm was coming. The storm arrived just after dawn, a malevolent gray wave rolling in from the coast. It was not the cleansing rinse of a summer shower. It was a physical assault, The sky turned the color of a bruise, and the wind began to howl through the pines, a sound of grieving and rage. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that blurred the world into a churning chaos of green and gray. The temperature plummeted. It was a day for the world to close its doors and wait. John had prepared. He had moved his few essentials inside the container, creating a small, defensible space. He had secured the heavy door, leaving it open just a crack to watch. The air inside was cold and damp, but it was a fortress against the tempest outside. Ghost lay at his feet, calm and watchful, his breathing the only steady rhythm in a world gone mad. John sat on the edge of the steel desk, a canteen of water in his hand, his mind a quiet, focused void. The time for thought was over. The time for reaction had begun. He didn't have to wait long. Through the driving rain, he saw them. Not Corbin's pristine SUV this time, but a heavy-duty flatbed truck, its engine straining, its oversized tires churning the forest floor into a muddy soup. It was followed by a rugged-looking work van. They stopped 50 feet from the container, their diesel engines a low, guttural throb against the shriek of the wind. Corbin emerged from the van, this time dressed in functional, dark rain gear. The polite mask was gone completely, his face set in a grim, determined scowl. 4 other men got out with him. They were not executives. They were big, hard-looking men, their faces impassive, their movements economical. They wore work gloves and carried tools that could be used for more than construction. One of them, a younger man with the unmistakable bearing of a military veteran, seemed different. His eyes were constantly scanning, his posture less aggressive, more watchful. He was the conflicted insider, though John didn't know it yet.
"Last chance," Corbin shouted over the roar of the storm. "Walk away. Now."
John didn't answer. He simply stood up and moved to the doorway, filling the opening with his body. It was a simple, unambiguous statement. He was not leaving. Corbin swore, a sharp, ugly sound carried away by the wind. He gestured to his men. "Get him out of the way, and get that winch hooked up. I want this box on the truck in an hour." The men advanced, spreading out. 2 of them were uncoiling a fixed steel cable from a massive winch mounted on the flatbed. The other 2, including a large, impatient man with a thick neck and a brutish face, moved toward John. "Don't be a fool," the big man grunted, rain plastering his hair to his skull. "Just step aside." John remained motionless. He was not a fighter, not anymore. He was a guardian. His purpose was not to win a brawl, but to delay, to endure. The big man lost his patience. He lunged forward, his intention to grab John and throw him bodily out of the way. But he never reached him. Ghost moved like a dark blur. He didn't bark. He didn't snarl. He launched himself at the man, not with his teeth, but with his body, a solid 90 pounds of muscle and bone hitting the man squarely in the chest. The man staggered back with a grunt of surprise, tripping over an exposed root and falling heavily into the mud. The other man hesitated, looking from the downed man to the dog, who now stood over him, snarling, a clear line drawn in the mud. The standoff was absolute. Corbin yelled at them, his voice thin with fury. "Deal with the dog! Get it done!" The chaos of the moment was amplified by the storm. The wind gusted, whipping a loose length of the winch cable into the air. The man operating the winch, distracted by the confrontation, had left the tension slack. The heavy chain and hook at the end of the cable, weighing a good 30 pounds, swung in a wild, unpredictable arc. It happened in a heartbeat. The chain whipped through the air, a pendulum of black steel. John saw it coming. He shouted, a wordless cry of warning. Ghost, his attention on the man in the mud, turned at the sound of John's voice. He tried to dodge, but he wasn't fast enough.
The heavy chain caught him across the hindquarters, a sickening, solid thud that was audible even over the storm. The dog yelped, a sharp, piercing cry of pure pain that cut through John's soul. Ghost's back legs collapsed under him. He fell to the wet ground, trying to rise, his hind leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Time stopped. The rain, the wind, the shouting men, Corbin's enraged face, it all faded into a distant, muffled roar. All John could see was his partner, his friend, his last connection to a life of honor, lying broken in the mud. And the memory. The wolf he had been outrunning for 5 years finally caught him. It wasn't a memory. It was a reliving. The dust of Kandahar, thick and choking. The smell of cordite. The shouting on the radio. The face of Thorne's brother, the Afghan guide, looking at him with trust as the firefight erupted. The tactical map in John's mind. The high-value target was exposed, a fleeting opportunity. Securing him was the mission objective. But Thorne's brother was pinned down, his exit route cut off. The call was his to make. "We have to pull him out," one of his team had yelled. "Negative," John had replied, his voice cold, distant, the voice of the mission. "We secure the package. We can't spare the men." He had made the choice. Mission over loyalty, objective over man. He had secured the target, and Thorne's brother had been overrun. John had watched it happen through the grainy feed of a drone, a silent, terrible movie. He had chosen to abandon a man who trusted him. He had chosen to leave his post as a guardian and become a hunter, and the cost had been his soul. Now the universe was giving him the same test, rewritten in the mud and rain of a Washington forest. The container was the objective. The secret inside, the justice for Eris Thorne, was the mission. And at his feet was his partner, injured, vulnerable, betrayed by a moment of chaos. He could hold his ground, protect the container, see the mission through. Or he could go to his dog. He looked at Ghost, who whined, a soft, pleading sound, his intelligent eyes locked on John's face. He looked at Corbin's men, who were now cautiously advancing, seeing their opportunity. And in that instant, John made a different choice. He broke. He ran. He abandoned his post at the door of the container. He ignored Corbin's triumphant shout, ignored the men moving past him. He ignored the mission. He went to his dog. He fell to his knees in the mud and rain, his hands gentle as he ran them over Ghost's shivering body. "I'm here, boy," he whispered, the words a prayer, an apology, an oath. "I'm here. I'm not leaving you." He carefully examined the injured leg. It was bad, likely broken, but the dog was alive. John pulled off his field jacket, the olive-drab fabric dark with rain, and gently wrapped it around the dog, shielding him from the wind and cold. He chose loyalty. He chose to stay. He chose the man, or in this case, the dog, over the mission. It was an act of personal treason against the operator he used to be, and an act of absolute salvation for the man he was trying to become. As John knelt in the mud, cradling his partner, a strange sense of peace settled over him, even as the mission was failing behind him. He had made the right choice, the only choice that mattered. "Get it open! Get those tapes!" Corbin yelled, his voice giddy with victory. He and his men converged on the container. The big man who Ghost had knocked down was back on his feet, a crowbar in his hand. He jammed it into the crack of the door. But the younger man, the one with the veteran's eyes, hesitated. He had watched the whole thing. He had seen the quiet man's stand. He had seen the dog's fierce loyalty. And he had just watched that same man abandon everything to go to his injured partner. It struck a chord deep inside him, a chord of a brotherhood he had once known. He looked at Corbin's greedy, triumphant face,
and then at the kneeling man and his wounded dog. And something inside him broke. As the big man put his weight on the crowbar, the younger man stumbled, his boot slipping in the slick mud. He fell against the other man, knocking him off balance. The crowbar flew from his grasp and disappeared into a deep pool of muddy water. "Idiot!" Corbin screamed. It was only a delay of a few seconds, but it was enough.
At that exact moment, two sets of headlights cut through the gray curtain of the storm. A battered but official-looking county truck, followed by a vintage pickup, slid to a halt, blocking the service road. The doors opened, and Martha Riley, the county clerk, stepped out, wrapped in a heavy-duty rain slicker. From the other truck, the old cartographer, Elias Vance, emerged, holding a large, waterproof map case. John had made one call the night before. One short, cryptic call from his satellite phone to the number Martha had given him for her office. He had said only 4 words. Ethelred, Thorne, Project 77B. It was a shot in the dark, a desperate hope that the name and the project number would mean something to her, that her innate sense of order and propriety would be offended. It had been enough. Martha's face was a mask of cold fury. She was no longer just a clerk. She was an embodiment of the law, of the rules that Corbin had broken.
She held up a phone, its screen glowing. "Sheriff is on his way," she announced, her voice cutting through the wind. "And I do believe this is a protected federal watershed. I'm quite sure you don't have the permits for this kind of heavy equipment." Corbin's face went pale. His authority, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, crumbled in the face of one competent, unimpressed woman in a raincoat. His crew stopped, looking from him to Martha, their thin loyalty evaporating. The tide had turned. Not with a bang, but with the quiet arrival of the truth. John, still kneeling in the mud, his hand resting on Ghost's flank, looked up and met Martha's gaze. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He had stayed. And this time, it had saved everything. The morning after the storm was unnaturally bright, the world washed clean. The sun, a rare and welcome visitor, streamed through the canopy, turning the lingering raindrops on the pine needles into 1,000 tiny prisms of light.
The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and ozone. The forest was preternaturally quiet, the violence of the storm replaced by a profound cathedral-like peace. The scene of the confrontation was transformed. The muddy ground was now cordoned off with yellow tape that read, "Sheriff's Line, do not cross." The flatbed truck and the work van were still there, but they looked like abandoned artifacts, inert and powerless. A county sheriff's vehicle was parked beside them. Corbin was gone. He had been escorted away by a grim-faced deputy the night before, his protests and legal threats dissolving into sullen silence as Martha Riley and Elias Vance presented their evidence, the old maps, the redacted project files, and the simple, damning fact of the container's existence. John sat on the rear bumper of Elias's old pickup, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He had not slept. He had spent the night watching over Ghost, who now lay on a thick blanket in the truck's bed. A local vet, a friend of Elias's, had come out at dawn. The leg was a clean break, and she had set and splinted it with practiced skill. She'd given the dog a mild sedative, and he was now sleeping peacefully, his breathing deep and even. John's own olive field jacket, now dry, was draped over him like a royal shroud. State environmental agents in crisp official windbreakers were methodically working the site, taking soil samples and photographs. They treated the container not as an obstacle to be removed, but as a crime scene to be preserved. They moved with a quiet reverence, their professional detachment a stark contrast to the brutish haste of Corbin's crew. The truth, unearthed, was now being carefully catalogued and protected. John watched them work, the coffee warming his hands but doing little to penetrate the deep chill of exhaustion in his bones. He felt hollowed out,
but it was a clean, empty feeling, not the jagged emptiness of grief he had carried for so long.
He had faced the ghost and, by choosing differently, had laid it to rest. He heard a car approaching on the service road, its tires crunching softly on the gravel that the county had already laid down to stabilize the path. He didn't look up. He expected another official vehicle, more agents or deputies. But the engine sound was wrong. A smaller, quieter car. It pulled to a stop behind the pickup. A door opened and closed. He heard footsteps, light and hesitant, approaching him. He still didn't look up. He just stared into his coffee cup, at his own reflection, distorted and unfamiliar. "John?" The voice was from another lifetime. He looked up. It was his sister, Sarah. He hadn't seen her in 2 years, not since he had walked out of his old life, leaving nothing but a short, inadequate note. She stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself, her face a mixture of worry, relief, and a deep, sorrowful confusion. She looked older than he remembered, the lines around her eyes telling a story of the years he had been absent. It had been Martha. After the sheriff had taken Corbin, she had sat with John by the fire Elias had built and had gently, persistently asked questions. Not about the container, but about him. She had seen the depth of his exhaustion, the isolation he wore like a second jacket. And with a bit of official sleuthing, she had found a number for his next of kin. She had called Sarah. They looked at each other for a long, silent moment, the gulf of years and unspoken words stretching between them. There were no recriminations in her eyes, only a profound sadness. John didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" felt too small. "I'm back" felt like a lie. Sarah's gaze drifted from his face to the sleeping dog in the back of the truck, his leg in its clean white cast. She looked back at John, at the mud caked on his pants, the dark circles under his eyes, and she seemed to understand something essential, something beyond explanations. "You stayed," she said, her voice quiet, thick with emotion. It wasn't a question. It was a recognition. It wasn't about the container, or the police, or the men who had come. It was about him. "You didn't run this time." It was everything he could never say, encapsulated in 2 words. He felt a cracking deep inside him, a fissure in the wall he had built around his heart. He could only nod, the movement stiff, unfamiliar. She came forward and, for the first time since they were children, she put her arms around him. It was an awkward, hesitant hug, but it was real. He could feel the slight tremor in her shoulders. He remained stiff for a moment, an old instinct. Then slowly he raised a hand and placed it on her back. He was reconnecting, plugging back into a world he had thought was lost to him forever. Later that day, after Sarah had left with a promise to return, one of the state agents, a serious woman with kind eyes, approached him. She was holding one of Eris Thorne's logbooks, protected in a clear evidence bag. "The tapes, your testimony. It's all here," she said. "Athelred Industries is already in full damage control, but it's too late. This is going to be a landmark case. Dr. Thorne, he's going to be a hero." She paused. "We'd like you to stay on, if you're willing, as a temporary site custodian, just to keep an eye on things during the initial investigation. You know this land better than anyone." John looked from the agent's face to the container, then to the sleeping form of his partner. Stay. The word echoed in his mind. It was the word that had condemned him in Afghanistan. It was the word that had redeemed him here. He was no longer running. He had a post to man. "I'll stay," he said. And the words felt like coming home. He looked at his reflection in the window of the sheriff's truck.
at the face of a man who was no longer a ghost, and for the first time in 5 years, he did not turn away. Weeks bled into a month. The initial flurry of official activity subsided, replaced by the quiet, steady work of environmental reclamation. The circus moved on, leaving the mountain to its silence once more. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the empty, hollow quiet of isolation, but the full, resonant quiet of a place with a purpose, a place that was healing. John stayed. He and Ghost moved into Elias Vance's old, unused line shack, a small, rustic cabin a few miles from the site. It was simple, solid, and real. Elias brought them supplies once a week, the two men sharing a thermos of coffee in comfortable silence, their friendship forged not in words, but in shared respect.
Sarah came up every weekend, bringing groceries and news from the outside world. Her presence, a gentle, persistent weaving of the threads of family he had thought were irrevocably severed. They talked, not about the past, but about the future, about small, simple things. The conversations were like learning a new language, but he was a patient student. His days fell into a new rhythm. Every morning, he and Ghost would walk the perimeter of the site. Ghost's limp was nearly gone, replaced by a slight, swaggering gait that John privately found amusing. The dog was older, scarred, but he carried his injury like a medal. The yellow tape was gone, replaced by a permanent yet discreet wire fence and a simple bronze plaque that had been installed near the container. It read, "The Thorn Ecological Study Area, in memory of Dr. Aris Thorn, who gave his life to protect this valley." The container itself remained, a silent, rust-colored monument. It was not an object of dread anymore, but a testament to a truth that had refused to stay buried. One afternoon, John sat on a rocky outcrop overlooking the lake where he had first made camp. It was the same lake, the same polished steel water, the same bruised purple sky. But he was not the same man. Ghost lay beside him, his head resting on John's knee, his breathing slow and content. The military issue watch was still on John's wrist, but he no longer checked it obsessively. Time was no longer an enemy to be endured, but a river to be navigated. He looked out over the vast expanse of forest and granite. He had come here to disappear, to become as silent and unseen as the wind. He had sought to erase himself. But the mountain had demanded something different. It had not allowed him to hide. It had forced him to be seen. It had presented him with a choice, a chance to face the echo of his deepest failure and answer it not with flight, but with fidelity. He had chosen to protect his partner, to honor a bond of loyalty that transcended tactics and objectives. In that one simple act of staying, of choosing the one life he was responsible for over the abstract mission, he had found a kind of absolution the wilderness alone could never provide. He hadn't outrun his ghosts. He had turned and faced them, and in doing so, had found they were not wolves after all, but guides, leading him back to the man he was supposed to be. A cool breeze swept up from the lake, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. John closed his eyes, feeling it on his face. The silence was still there, deep and profound, but it no longer held the weight of his past. It held the quiet promise of his future. The mountain was no longer a hiding place. It was home. And the peace he felt was not the peace of surrender, but the deep, earned peace of a man who had finally and truly stood his ground.